It's my great pleasure to welcome Sanjay Reddy, and it's really great to have you.
Well, thank you, Andrew, for this very kind invitation. And despite the changed circumstances and the fact that we're doing this over this technology, I should say that when I first received your invitation to participate in this seminar, I was very honored and also very delighted by the chance to be able to discuss these issues with you, Andrew, but also with your group, which is always very interesting. You assemble very intellectually serious and also socially engaged students around you. And so I was very, very pleased about that. And let me say, and those who can read between the lines will understand what I mean by this. This is by way of contrast to much of what happens at the New School. So I've often said that Andrew is the living, beating heart of the NSSR, the former graduate faculty. And so it really is tremendously nice to be part of this. But let me also say that I was intrigued by the invitation to speak about János Kornai, because I've been engaged with Kornai's ideas and had some personal contact with him as well, which I'll say something about in a moment, for many years. And of course, given Andrew's Hungarian connections, I was on the one hand a little bit hesitant to declaim about a figure like Kornai, about whom no doubt Andrew and others here will know a great deal. And in Andrew's case, more than I. But nevertheless, I thought that as an economist and as a colleague who's playing a part in this collective endeavor, it was something that I could do, which would also be very interesting to me. And so I was very glad from that point of view to have this opportunity, even though it's been some years since I've gone back and read Kornai's work carefully. But I do often rely on Kornai in my dialogues with students at the New School, many of whom are enthusiasts for socialism. And in my own role as a voice of realism, I ask them to read Kornai. And I'm not sure that many of them actually take me up on it, but I wish that they would, because I think that enthusiasms of all kinds should be tempered by elements of realism. And I think this is one reason, if I may be very candid, some students in the department and others may think that I am less enthusiastic for the things that I wish to dampen their enthusiasm about than in fact I am. But that would be an error of inference on their part. I am interested in realistic utopias, not necessarily only in the Rawls or Eric Olin Wright sense, but speaking very loosely, realizable possibilities. Because I think that that's part of our responsibility as social scientists, to think about realizable possibilities and not merely about ideals. And this is something I underline in my engagements, including in our own institution. And I think sometimes that's misunderstood, but if it will be misunderstood, let it be misunderstood. That's not my doing. I think that the important point is that a dose of realism is very useful in discussions of socialism. And one reason for that is, of course, that socialism is a project which it is claimed is about people's real lives, the ways in which they actually experience their lives. To use a phrase that Amartya Sen, my former teacher and mentor to some degree, likes to use, it's about how people's lives go, how they actually go. Okay, and let me underline that. I'm sorry to be pedestrian, but I really want to underline this. If people are made to starve in the name of an ideal, then their lives are not going very well. And that ought to be relevant to us as social scientists. And this is why I get irritated. And I'm sorry to make my politics and my academic engagements come together in this way. But I get irritated when people come to the defense of one or another regime. I won't name the regimes at this moment, but I can if you want. In the contemporary world, one or another regime which claims to be socialist, but is meanwhile tolerating calamities for its population, and seemingly avoidable calamities, while pointing a finger at external imperialists or other causes, putative causes, by way of explanation for the conditions which prevail. That to me is a very, very serious problem for a theory and for an ideal. There has to be some accountability of ideals and ideas in relation to outcomes. And I think that this is a discipline which we should all try to practice and keep in mind as intellectuals as well as activists and citizens, in my view. So if you will excuse that programmatic ejaculation on my part prior to the more disciplined intellectual remarks, let me go now to Kornai himself. I was privileged to hear Kornai quite early on in my own education. Of course, there's a bit of a generational difference between Andrew and me. I heard Kornai first when I was an undergraduate, late undergraduate, which was around 1990, and then later on as a graduate student. For many years, I was a graduate student at the same institution at Harvard. And over the years, I heard him many times speak. I attended his lectures, and I read his work, or attempted to do so. I was exposed to it in different ways. So I got a little bit of a sense of the man and his ideas from that opportunity to orbit around him, to be in a narrow orbit around him in some sense, even though I should say I never actually spoke with him. So it's not that I had a direct relationship as a student, but I took the opportunity to listen to him, to go to his classes, to hear his public lectures on various occasions, and to read his work. And of course, also to witness this in the broader context of an economics department in a leading institution, which was deeply concerned with the problems that were then referred to as ones of transition, namely the question of how the former socialist regimes, centrally planned regimes, in particular former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, but also everywhere, would make a shift to, it was presumed, though this was not always spelled out, Kornai had the intellectual integrity to spell it out, but it wasn't always spelled out this way, a transition to capitalism. And of course, there were very many people in that department who were engaged in this as advisors at quite a high level. Jeffrey Sachs, for instance, Andrei Schleifer, and many others who played an integral role in determining the content of that transition and the methodology of that transition in various countries, including in Poland, Czech Republic, Russia, and so forth. So the questions were live, and for a young person who's interested in understanding systems in a comparative frame, which was part of what János Kornai's official mandate in that department was to do, to teach what was called comparative economic systems, but also as someone interested in alternatives, realizable, better possibilities. It was very important to hear what Kornai had to say. I should admit, for my own part, and here again I will be perhaps unduly personal, I was disappointed by what I heard, in that, and I will come back to this toward the end of my remarks, which I hope will be short so we can have more discussion, in that I felt that Kornai was, let us say, a much better analyst of socialism than of capitalism. And that in this sense, he was not actually engaged in a study of comparative economic systems. He was engaged in the study of one economic system, namely socialism, and its inadequacies as he understood it, as he understood them. But he was not actually adopting a truly comparative frame to understand the strengths and weaknesses of different economic systems and forms of economic organization, so that one could have a meaningful discussion about that. And well, maybe I will say something that I would have said later on, or originally planned to say later on in my remarks, just to make clear what I have in mind. One of Kornai's well-known ideas, perhaps even his best-known idea, is that of the soft budget constraint. And the idea of the soft budget constraint, as you will know if you've read the relevant chapter in The Socialist System that was assigned to you, or others, or come across it elsewhere, is the notion that firms in socialist systems do not really face a hard budget constraint, the contrast to a soft budget constraint, in the sense that if they make losses persistently, they will go out of business. They need never go out of business because there's a political imperative to save them from going out of business so as to maintain employment, for example, and because the subventions that they receive from the state, the prices which they are allowed to charge, and so forth, are all political decisions, which therefore are subject to potential negotiation with political authorities in the vertical mode of negotiation, which Kornai describes, between the managers and the state authorities who supervise enterprises. And so chronic losses can emerge and persist over time. The efficiencies of potential bankruptcy, or the efficiencies that are generated by the discipline of potential bankruptcy, never emerge. And this leads, potentially at least, to a spiral of inefficiency, losses, and subsidies, which go on until such a point as they become a macroeconomic problem for the entire state, and not just a microeconomic problem for individual enterprises. Because, of course, all of the enterprises are experiencing these kinds of problems, not just one. And when you aggregate across these different losses of different firms, you get a giant ballooning loss at the level of the aggregate, which in turn leads to problems of coherence of the plan, financing of the state revenues, state expenditures, and so forth. So the concept of a soft budget constraint was very important to János Kornai's understanding of what went wrong in existing socialism. And it was indeed a very fruitful concept to introduce from that point of view. But what Kornai did not perhaps fully appreciate is that it had a much wider applicability than in existing socialism. And this point was brought home to me first by the writings of the Chinese political scientist, whom Andrew will know, student of Adam Brzezinski, namely Zhiyan Cui, or Cui Zhiyan, who is now at Tsinghua University in Beijing, but was then at MIT, who wrote in the mid-1990s about the applicability of the soft budget constraint concept to capitalism, looking at, for example, bailouts. And at that time, he was interested in bailouts of the Detroit automakers, for instance, as an example, which emerged as a result of the political impossibility of permitting those firms to go bankrupt in even a capitalist economy, because of course, even capitalist economies are also political in this sense. There are political imperatives which can cause the state to act. So the idealized picture of a capitalist economy as one in which the state doesn't exist, the Walrasian or general equilibrium model, which Kornai might have had in mind as a counterpart, of course, is not the reality of the capitalist system, which does involve also a political element, which is always present, even if it is not always visible, but which becomes visible in moments such as bailouts. And this, of course, is something that also became very evident post-2008, when many more people started to talk about this question of soft budget constraints in relation to capitalist systems. And of course, the debate on whether firms that were so-called too big to fail firms, especially in the finance sector, should be bailed out or not, introduced the concept of a soft budget constraint for a wider audience. At least some of the specialist writings did. So we saw that János Kornai's concept was actually much more applicable beyond the original context that he thought it was appropriate for than he may himself have understood. So that's just one example, and others can be easily, I think, brought into the discussion of how a more truly comparative analysis, applying Kornai's insights and concepts, might lead to a little bit different conclusion than he came to, right? His conclusion was that basically socialism's economic inefficiencies stem from its intrinsically political nature, and these economic inefficiencies would necessarily balloon until a point that the failings or the failure of that system relative to capitalism became impossible to any longer tolerate, which is a reason that he toward the end of his life, and by the time he was writing The Socialist System, and by the time I met him, had come to the conclusion that there was no other game in town, so to speak, if I could be a little colloquial, but capitalism. And capitalism understood in a very streamlined and simplified way, I would add, which is another aspect of the sense in which I would say Kornai was not a truly comparative thinker. And I say this despite my tremendous respect for him. Okay, I'm not trying to puncture a Kornai balloon here or bubble. I'm trying to or to undermine him. Quite the contrary. I view him with tremendous respect, but I just want to situate intellectually what I think he did and did not do. Okay. Let me make a few more remarks about Kornai, and then we can have a broader discussion. So I think one of the most important points about Kornai, which I've already referred to just now, is his understanding of the system as political, right? And I would say, allied to that, that he understood it as bureaucratic. You know, these are, of course, not exactly the same thing, but they have a relationship. And you are sociologists, many of you at least, so you know that there are ways in which classically one has thought about party and bureaucracy, or party politics and bureaucracy, for example, differently. But he certainly viewed it as fundamentally a political system with a bureaucratic dimension, which was profound. He therefore underlined that one needed a political economy to study it. I gave you an example, the soft budget constraint, but there are other examples as well, in which the day-to-day economic decisions which had to be made in the socialist system necessarily became in different ways ones that had to be referred to political authorities, and which became subject to politicized negotiations within the bureaucracy. And for this reason, in his view, the kind of disciplines as well as the forms of rationality which emerged in the capitalist system to undergird economic activity did not, and indeed could not, emerge in the socialist system. Okay. Now, he was referring, in talking about the socialist system, to a very particular kind of regime, as he outlines at the very beginning of the book, the socialist system. He was particularly interested in ones ruled by communist parties. And he had in mind that these had a vertical hierarchical mode at the center of their economic governance. And so there might be, other forms of experience in socialism which he paid inadequate attention to, but this was what he chose to focus on. So there is this feature, its political character, which is its undoing in the end. It's intrinsic to it, and it is ultimately its fatal flaw. Okay, if I had to summarize Kornai in one sentence, it would be that. This is the feature that defines it, and this is its fatal flaw. Okay, and one could then describe exactly how that works out, the reasons why that is so in respect of different issues and problems, whether it is the soft budget constraint, as I just mentioned, or the shortage economy, or the investment hunger, or other issues which he talks about. Okay. And this is the reason, or a reason, that he viewed it as simply being infeasible for socialism ultimately to sustain itself. The political economy of shortages was something that we were just discussing, Andrew and I don't know how many of you heard that discussion just before we began the formal part of today's class. This was an idea, again, which Kornai very much, if not pioneered, at least contributed to in a fundamental way. I became familiar with the idea of the political economy of shortage through the Indian debate. because there had been a discussion in India in the 1970s and 80s, especially the late 1970s and early 1980s, about the notion that the Indian intermediate regime, as it came to be called, drawing on the ideas of Kaleski with respect to Indonesia, was one which suffered chronically from shortages, that this was a feature of this mixed regime. And there was also the notion that these chronic shortages were not a problem for everyone. In fact, they were rather desirable from the standpoint of the well-positioned firms, which were able to realize economic rents, supernormal profits, as a consequence of being politically authorized to be the only firms which produced certain goods, for example. And this was an idea, again, which many people contributed to: Raj Krishna, Prem Shankar Jha, Barbara Harris, then Barbara Harris, now Barbara Harris White, and many others, drawing on, again, on Kaleski. But I think that the framework that Kornai developed for the socialist economies was different in a very important respect, in that he saw the political economy of shortages in the socialist system as arising less from a sort of from the existence of a sort of a cabal of rent-seeking firms in league with the bureaucrats, which was the diagnosis of the intermediate regime in developing countries, mixed economies, and saw it rather, I think, more as a kind of a tragic consequence of the inability of the economic system to organize itself rationally. And that arose in part from fundamental incentive problems, which is something that Kornai was deeply attentive to, and which caused him to be viewed as not a friendly, but an unfriendly critic of socialism, I think, by many people within the socialist countries at the time. And I'd love to hear more of what Andrew knows about this and can tell us about what happened in that regard, in particular in Hungary. My understanding, just if I could take a slight detour before going back to the main discussion about the political economy of shortages, but my understanding is that Kornai became disillusioned with the Hungarian socialist system, initially for political reasons, not for economic reasons. He was deeply disturbed by the fact that some of his friends who became dissidents were treated quite brutally by the events of 1956. And he became a much more serious critic of the regime's economic performance thereafter, even though he had been, I understand, pursuing and following the economic debate for some period of time before that. A journalist, he was not a trained economist, though he received an economics degree later on, I believe. But he was essentially a journalist. He had been following the debate, but it was not his focus. And it was after his political disillusionment that he decided to become, or he became much more of an analyst of the economic performance of the socialist system and much more of a critic of that, initially in Hungary and then in a much more broad-based comparative way, looking at other socialist countries and their interactions and so on. And of course, Kornai, it should be added, had also been a true believer. The disillusion followed real enthusiasm on his part for the socialist system. So that was quite a transformation, and I think was one of the reasons that the political nature of the system was always very much in his mind. Okay, but to go back to the main point I was making about the political economy of shortages, the incentive problem that managers of firms are not actually terribly bothered whether or not their enterprise is maximizing surplus, so to speak, right? Whether it's minimizing costs, whether it's doing its best from a technical efficiency point of view, because they are, like people everywhere, motivated by rather mundane things, including minimizing the work that they do if they can, having prestige and having the favor of their higher ups, and many other such considerations which might militate in a different direction. Right now, obviously, if you are a believer in the new socialist man, then this type of reference to the quotidian concerns of managers, which is quite deflationary with respect to the claims of the socialist system, might seem rather threatening. And I think Kornai was indeed treated as saying something that was anathema from that standpoint for quite a long period of time. Again, this is from what little I understand about his own personal history. But Kornai, I think, simply did not believe that the ideological mobilization that socialism sustained for some period of time to generate high levels of work effort, for instance, could be sustained. He thought that these everyday motivational facts about human beings, which were present everywhere, would come to the fore, did come to the fore in the socialist system, and the lack of, to use economic jargon, the lack of high-powered incentives to get managers to work and to get ordinary workers to work in an effective way was a very, very serious problem for the socialist system. So there was a connection between the microeconomic and the macroeconomic failings of the system, and there was also a meso level, so to speak, which had to do with the enterprise's inability to organize themselves in a fully technically efficient fashion. And Kornai then elaborated how this would give rise to various kinds of difficulties. That, for example, consumers would have quite a lot of hardship finding the goods which they most wanted. And of course, this was not just because the firms producing those goods were not maximizing their output, but also because consumer goods production was simply not a priority in the socialist system. It was ideologically and practically deprioritized in favor of industrial goods production, and especially heavy and chemical industries. So, as the Koreans would say. So the shortage, the perennial shortage of consumer goods, would lead consumers to then go, first of all, after spending a lot of time to look for their first best available consumer goods, and not succeeding in getting hold of them in certain cases, to go on to a second best or a third best or fourth best alternative. So there would be a cascade in which ultimately consumers would get something which in some inadequate and partial way satisfied their goals after considerable effort, but would not fully do so. And there was no imperative for the system to resolve this difficulty at any level. The same problem was mirrored between firms, because of course there are complex inter-firm relationships in any economy, capitalist or socialist. This was something which Olivier Blanchard, the MIT economist, described in that was simply called disorganization, about the transition in the 1990s, to refer to the breakdown of industrial production in Russia, that firms couldn't get what they needed by way of inputs from other firms. In the socialist system, guaranteed that by administrative fiat. And once the state stopped providing that fiat, but a market economy had also emerged at this time, you had what Blanchard called disorganization. And the firms were forced to either shut down or to engage in all sorts of madcap antics, Wild West antics, in order to trade various kinds of goods which they had available to get the inputs they needed in order to stay afloat. So the system is resolved in different ways in this problem is resolved in different ways in different systems. And in the social system, it was by and large because firms were instructed to supply other firms with inputs that they did so. And it was not because they were being paid prices which were necessarily remunerative, because those prices were set administratively, and whatever losses they made were fulfilled by the general government revenue. And if they made profits, those profits were also taken over by the general government revenue, therefore also diminishing the interest or incentive which the managers had to produce. So it was the administrative fiat which ultimately underlined underlay the provision of inputs to enterprises. And for this reason, again, there were not sufficiently high-powered incentives to ensure that the firms that provided the inputs did so with adequate regularity and to the required extent. And so there was also a political economy of shortages which resulted in the interfirm production system, which of course ramified and led to a further reason for the consumer shortages. Now, I should move toward ending, so let me just add one more layer. There are lots of different issues here. I mentioned investment hunger, for example, which I can't take up or won't take up just now. But one of the reasons that the socialist system also came under increasing pressure was that ultimately it did need to engage in foreign trade. It did need to procure certain inputs from abroad. It was also possible for the people in socialist countries to witness the productive accomplishments and technological developments in capitalist countries. And consumer aspirations, as well as personal aspirations, could not be completely put aside. And so there was growing pressure on the system to reorganize itself in order to be able to respond to those aspirations. The emphasis on political control, on producing for the military in order to ultimately underpin that, and other distortions of the socialist system became harder and harder to sustain in this situation. Now, all of this might seem to you rather hackneyed, capitalistic criticism of the socialist system, but I think what's very important for you to understand and for all of us to understand is that János Kornai's understanding of this set of problems, his analysis of this set of problems, was hard-won. It came through bitter experience, it came through close learning and observation. And this is why I think one does have to respect that very much, even if one sees some limitations in Kornai's ability really to place socialism in a truly comparative perspective, as I argued earlier, and therefore to understand that the limitations of existing socialism on the Eastern Bloc model and the limitations of existing capitalism should really be understood under a single portmanteau, which I think he had not done, but which others can do, building upon Kornai. And of course, if one were to ask the question, for instance, why has China succeeded, despite the fact that China didn't jump to a capitalist economy, as Jeffrey Sachs asked Poland to do, and Russia to do, we would have to say, I think, that the reasons are ones which we can't fully understand in terms of Kornai's dichotomy between unsustainable socialism and productive capitalism. And I think that Kornai was also quite deeply inattentive to the problems of capitalism with respect to mass poverty, inequality, and many other concerns. And these are limitations of Kornai as an intellectual and as an analyst of the contemporary world, even though he excelled in terms of his analysis of the deficiencies of one part of that world. So what I would say in the end is one cheer, or if you like, two cheers for János Kornai. Let me end there.
Thank you very much. That's a wonderful presentation, and you make it really come alive, which I think given this topic is important because, I mean, after all, yes, there are a couple of command economies around the world still, but most people think that this is not necessarily today's problem. It's to some extent Kornai's fault that people might react that way, and I think you explained the reason very well. When was the period when you attended classes with him? 90s, I guess, right?
Yeah, I think I first heard him in 90 and then again between 93 and 99 or so.
I know him from earlier. I think the first time I met him is I invited him to lecture at the graduate faculty that we used to call the NSSR. And he indeed gave a very good lecture. I think it's the same as the essay, Hungarian Reform Process, Visions, Hopes, and Realities, where he gave a strong critique of the Hungarian reform, both in its theory and in its practice. And I don't even think that his judgment that Hungary has become an autocracy is correct. I think it's a hybrid system of some kind, even today, even in this emergency, when it actually is coming close to a model of temporary dictatorship. But on the other hand, with all that said, I think that his work is great. Not because I'm convinced by all of it, but at least compared to the others who have written on the socialist system, and of course there are many authors, both West and East, he is the giant. I think you probably will agree with me that just in terms of the intellectuality of this, which you can see in this work, the socialist system, the synthetic ability, he is really a kind of first among at least equals, and perhaps even on a higher level than most of them. Nevertheless, I agree with you completely. He fails as a comparativist. That was interesting what you said, because I was going to say that too from a very different point of view than yours. What you said, and I agree with that too, he should not have only some kind of basically neoclassical ideal of capitalism when he compares to existing institutions and practices elsewhere. Of course, there's a theory of socialism too, but he focused on the reality of them. In fact, when he talks about market socialism, he says it's not so much the theory that matters, but these experiments, which in his mind always fail. With capitalism, it's just a kind of a model, intellectual model that he uses. What people now call the varieties of capitalism, the whole literature on this is not very important to him, nor does he really understand the role of state interventionism in any sophisticated way, and so on. So he certainly fails on that level. But what I was going to say is that he fails as a comparativist also in relation to socialism. I mean, after all, if you're really going to deal with the market socialist experiments, then you have first of all Poland, where agriculture is never statized. Then you have the Hungarian and Yugoslav models, where indicative command planning is dismantled completely. You have also, of course, the Yugoslav model, where I'm not sure of the date. We had a very good talk about that on Monday by Julie Mostov, but a worker self-management structure, which has some reality, was instituted. That's unique, and it makes it different than the other places. And then, of course, the most important thing, which now we all realize is the most important, China, where certainly until 1985, and Kornai would admit that, or maybe 1987 or 8, maybe until Tiananmen Square, it is a market socialist experiment of some kind, but very different than the others. I would say exactly as you did, that the idea that these are always unsuccessful fails alone in the face of China. But I traveled to Hungary a lot, and you did not experience huge shortages in the 80s or even the 70s. And I'm sure the same was true in Poland. Not in terms of consumer goods shortages, certainly food, which is the most important to most people. Yes, of course, there's a shortage of apartments. Everybody waits for cars, 2-3 years in Hungary, the time I used to go there. So there's a shortage of some important commodities, but not a comprehensive shortage economy, just the type that he described. Now, I think the problem lies with the fact that at some point he turned against market socialism too. And so he does really the same as in the case of capitalism. He has a kind of model of it. And you can see in one of the texts, I think Sanjay added it to the reading, the chapter on market socialism, he calls it dual dependence. He calls it a mixed system of both planning in some sense and market. He calls it a system of a hybrid form, which is basically inconsistent and self-contradictory, but it is a model, and certainly he does not prove that model in no form could have succeeded. Indeed, perhaps in China, it succeeded at least up to a certain point. Now, Kornai would now today say, yes, but then it also turned to a much more radical transition to capitalism. But even today, I think that China protects, you would know this much better, a very significant part of a state sector, and has not had, it had unemployment and so on, but not of the devastating type that the Central European countries had with the turn to full capitalism. So I think that that Kornai does not really compare on this level. Of course, you can talk about the theory, Lange, Bruce, Kornai himself, the theorists of market socialism, but I think it's also important to look at the experiences. Now, he has a general theory of why things must go wrong under market socialism. I think on page 361, there's 361 is a diagram with 5 blocks, starting with the political, then ownership as the second block, thirdly coordination, fourthly the actual structure of the economy, and fifthly only the results for the participants. These are really 5 big blocks. And he suggests there's a kind of deterministic relationship among them. The first block is the monolithic rule of a single party with a specific ideology. And the second block is public ownership of the means of production. And it follows from the ideology and from the monopolistic tendencies of that party that public ownership is going to be fully dominant in such a system. There's not going to be, even if there are private economic actors, even if there is some decentralization, the overwhelming proportion of the system of property will still be state-owned. And this means that the state or the bureaucratic structure will play also the dominant role in coordination. This is where I think he thinks all the market socialist experiments go wrong, because they keep the first 3 blocks, but they try to change the next 3. In other words, how the system is coordinated, it's going to be mixed market and plan, how it is going to be then managed on the macro and micro levels, and finally its consequences. These are the things that market socialists wish to change, while they want to maintain the monolithic rule of the single party and the predominance of state ownership. I think Kornai has good arguments why that mixture is unstable, or why the mixture does not produce the results that the market socialist experimenters or even the workers' control advocates in Yugoslavia wish to accomplish. But collective ownership or state ownership and the existence of a single political monolithic party will defeat their efforts with respect to trying to accomplish create a mixed system of coordination. Everything else will follow. For example, the budgetary constraint you'd know this much better. I don't believe it. I just can't believe it. He thinks, basically claims, it is just as soft under market socialist conditions as it was under the classical system. I don't believe it. I think to an important extent, they must have hardened it. Now, to what extent? I would say in China, in the 80s, it must have been considerably hardened. Considerably hardened. Of course, to really harden it, you really need, as you already said, the possibility of total failure, in other words, bankruptcy. But there are bankruptcies also under state socialist systems. He himself provides the data on this on one of the pages. I'm not going to find it. Even Hungary and Poland had bankruptcies, and China certainly has dismantled a significant part of the previously state-owned firm, or reconstructed them and merged them, which is, in some sense, a similar kind of consequence. So I think that Kornai fails because he does not consider, first of all, the differences among these different experiments, which amount to different socialisms. And then secondly, does not raise the question, what would happen if you remove the first block altogether? And indeed, in the place of the second block, you could put a pluralist system of property. Why should the preponderance? China today, I doubt, has a majority of state-owned firms. And even the state-owned firms have become joint stockholder corporations that are different than just a traditional state firm. So a mixed system, you can remove the monolithic party. For example, you could have political democracy of some kind or another. You could actually change the property system. You know, even France has 10, 15% or used to state-owned firms. So you could have a mixed property system, and then raise the question whether a system of more complicated coordination could produce the results that the market socialist wanted. This he doesn't wish to do because he wants to, at some point, I don't know when it happened, he wrote a piece in the very late 80s, which was put into English too, a very short booklet type book where he really seems to forget even most of his own earlier concepts and come out for a transition to nothing but pure capitalism. At some point, he convinced himself that all other efforts will fail, and the only solution is that. But you could come to that conclusion only if we follow, if we take your diagnosis seriously, Sanjay, namely that he neglects all the negative side effects of capitalist systems, and he neglects also the very great differences between them. To my surprise, at some point in one essay, I heard him say, or he actually writes, I'm no advocate of social democracy either. He's certainly no advocate of workers' control, even under capitalist systems, but he's no advocate of redistribution either. So he becomes an advocate of a capitalism that I think, as we're going to find out after this COVID crisis, may not exist, probably may not exist anywhere in the next 20 years, because even the United States is going to have to face the question whether a capitalism, which is no longer the classical one even here, can solve problems like the ones we have just faced. That's Kornai's message. There is no third way. Market socialism is a hybrid that doesn't work under any of its forms. And it's not just a question of the single party system. It doesn't work in any form. He raises the question, I end with this, what to do in Yugoslavia with the self-managing firms. He has a chapter on self-management. He says, this is not going to be very popular, he says, what I say. I think they should be repossessed by the state, he says, because that would be a more efficient and more likely road to privatization based on sales. The model of privatization he always favored is not coupons or not redistribution among the workers themselves or even among the citizens, but sales. It was always, and we don't have to go into this issue, but that's his preferred form of privatization. For that reason, he didn't necessarily think that privatization should be fast, because sales, require buyers. and people are not going to be rushing to buy these decrepit firms of state socialism. But you'd have better chance to sell the firms if the buyer doesn't have to face a workers' council. And so restatize them, take them back, go back to the 1948 system in Yugoslavia. Now, I don't know if this is what was done, but you can see how, in a way, he is become committed to a model of capitalism that is based on an extremely strong and undisputed dominance of private property, of market coordination, without really taking seriously all the negative effects of that kind of solution. So I'm done, Sanjay. I give you a chance to comment on any of that first, and then we'll open it up to the class.
Okay, thank you so much, Andrew. I think we see the issue very similarly, and I perhaps was in my subcontinental vein a little bit too respectful of somebody I view as a teacher. So I didn't want to come out swinging, but I agree with you. And I think that, I think in fact, I would even go one step beyond what you said, though I think, I hope you'll approve of this in the following sense. The failure you described of Kornai to be an analyst of the comparative forms of existing socialism is bound up with his failure to be a comparativist in the broader sense of comparing socialism and capitalism. Because if he had been, contrarily, an analyst of the different forms of existing socialism, then he would have been forced to recognize that, let's say, France and let's say Poland were not completely dissimilar in one or another respect. So there would be more of an element of convergence, which would come to the fore, or at least of a necessity to undertake comparisons that recognize that there were similarities in some dimensions, dissimilarities in other dimensions, if he had allowed his interpretation of the social system to be more attentive to these internal differences, just as capitalism, the varieties of capitalism literature you referred to recognizes, possesses internal differences. And I'm struck in this connection by the contrast between Kornai and Jaroslav Banek, whose thinking I know only a little bit. You might know it better about Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, who is one of the foremost analysts of the Yugoslav system in the West. And my interpretation of Vanek is that his view was that this is a system which has experienced certain challenges for some of the reasons Kornai mentioned, the political element in the management of the economic system, for instance, which had to be itself kept between certain kinds of guardrails in order for the system to function adequately. But on the other hand, it was doing reasonably well in some ways. And that the challenge was for Yugoslavia to manage the risks while achieving the positive things that were being achieved and extending those achievements in different ways. For example, Yugoslavia, unlike some of the other Eastern European countries, managed to avoid some of the inefficiencies at the microeconomic level, which arose elsewhere, precisely because firms were functioning in a quasi-market system, and there was an element of discipline which arose as a result of their competition with one another. And so the microeconomic problems were less severe, and they did not in turn give rise to the same level of macroeconomic imbalances as arose in those other countries. And so I very much agree that if he had been more attentive, if Kornai had been more attentive to these empirical variations, then that would have also, I think, enabled him though he wasn't very inclined to go in that direction, to be more truly a comparativist. I think that his impulse to take a dichotomous view probably had very deep-seated psychological or political roots, which is something to understand perhaps in a different discussion. But I think he wasn't perhaps in this way deeply empirical. He wasn't so interested in looking at the facts in a way that would divert from the dichotomous perspective. Just one point on China. I believe, last I looked at it, and I don't know if this is still true, but last I looked at it, state-owned enterprise employment in China had actually increased since 1980, not decreased. And that's because there's been a lot more growth of private sector employment without the state sector really shutting down. It's just been reorganized in certain ways, but it has not been shut down. And so the question of what to call China and how to think about China is very much open from this point of view and others.
In fact, just in one thing, because
let me stop there. Let's have general discussion.
Sorry. I think that Kornai has made some fantastic discoveries. And certainly the soft budgetary constraint, as it is linked to the contrast between resource and demand constraint, is something that we now, when we talk about socialism, we're going to have to take these kind of concepts seriously. The shortage economy certainly is an original and important discovery. But I completely agree with you that at some point, for some reason, which I don't know even biographically because I don't know him closely, he turned ideological. He turned ideological. And ideological in the sense that he made an ideology, now I don't want to say orthodox economics, neoclassical, certainly not Keynesian. He's hostile to Keynes because he thinks Keynesianism also softens the budgetary constraint. As far as I can tell, Denmark and Sweden and Norway are dynamic capitalist countries, and whatever one has done to the budgetary constraint has not affected very high levels of social welfare and indeed international involvement, because these are very open economies too. And yet, they're Keynesian in terms of the system of welfare that they have set up and the way that they work on effective demand. Kornai would not have, at least in his last persona, was hostile to all that. And so we have to recognize it, because it also means that his judgment about socialisms now in a plural is tainted in some way. Okay, so let's open up the floor.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Sanjay. It was very, very interesting. I just had, so it's mostly, I think, a clarification based on you and Andrew talked about his critique of socialism. So in a way, socialism is for him results in dictatorship because of centralization, I think, in some way. And so for him, it seems that one sufficient prerequisite for democracy is capitalism, right? In this sense. And if this is so, was he influenced in any way? I was just interested. Was he influenced by Hayek in any way or not?
So I'm just, thank you for that, Arya. I'm trying to think about this, and I'm sure Andrew has more thoughtful things to say, but if we were to ask, for Kornai, was democracy a prerequisite for capitalism, or was capitalism a prerequisite for democracy? I mean, clearly he views a defining feature of the socialist system as he focuses upon it as being its lack of democracy, right? Or it's having a sham democracy, essentially. that its democratic centralism is not that democratic; it's more centralist. I think so. I think that's a defining feature of the socialist system. But then he has this very dichotomous view in which presumably everything that's not the socialist system and that is ultimately worth considering is a capitalist in some measure. I just don't think he's particularly interested in the question of whether that capitalist alternative economic system is compatible with more than one type of political order or with only one type of political order, whether there's a unique pairing of democracy and capitalism that is sustainable over time. I'm not sure whether or not he's commented on that. I mean, certainly there was a moment during the transition when many people were arguing exactly that, but did Kornai specifically make that point, and did he elaborate on it? I actually don't know the answer. I wouldn't be surprised if he had, but I'm assuming that that was not his major preoccupation, because I think he wanted more to argue that the social system as he understood it was not economically feasible, nor did it conduce to human liberties, and for both of these reasons ought to be abandoned. Andrew?
Yeah, I seem to remember that one place he says that capitalism is not necessarily democratic. I think that obviously, you know, Pinochet's Chile would be the example that that people would point to in this context. But there are, of course, many others. I think what he would say is that, but he would say two things, is that socialism, as he has defined it, cannot be democratic. And secondly, that capitalism is a precondition of democracy, but a necessary, not a sufficient.
Quite.
Oh, sorry. Yes, a necessary one. Yes.
Necessary, but
I was sorry.
Exactly.
Yes. Not sufficient, but necessary. Yes, I was wrong. Yes.
He would put it, because of course he's he observes reality, but I think it's more important to say that if you want to democratize, you cannot keep that economic system, the socialist one, even in its market socialist version, which to me is pretty questionable. Whether market socialism, for example, could a multi-party system have been adopted in Yugoslavia in 1990? Could keeping basically the same self-managing system, perhaps removing more of the party interventionist dimension. Anyway, so who goes next?
Maybe a follow-up from Arya's question. Thanks a lot, Sanjay. I wanted to ask, so I mean, the way I read it, and this was so refreshing because I'm a good new school student, I guess. I haven't been reading anything that is so positivist for so long. And I wanted
That's a bad word, I suppose, positivist. You'll have to tell me whether it's first what it means, and second whether it's good or bad. I'm only partially joking, but go on.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask, so the way I read it, there is a clear necessity for, this capitalist transition, right? We have to transition from socialism to capitalism. But I don't understand, where does he draw, where he draws the line? Like, does he think state coercion plays a role here? It's clearly not as influenced from Hayek, as Hayek would say, it's going to be a spontaneous order, and it's just going to, capitalist system is just going to create itself spontaneously. And I don't see that in Kornai. So I wanted to ask, what's the state's role in this? Does he say that state coercion is okay as long as we are achieving to the capitalist transformation, or not?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Are you asking what Kornai's view was on whether coercion could be employed to bring about a transition from socialism as he understood it to capitalism?
Yes.
In the interest of some longer term good?
Yeah.
I don't know the answer to that question. I presume that, given his view, that capitalism was necessary as, maybe not sufficient, but necessary, as Andrew put it, for political values such as democracy and broad-based freedoms to be realized. useful, let me just say that I'm not sure that was a question of deep interest to Kornai, but coercion to overcome a coercive system would, I imagine, for Kornai have been more acceptable than not. But this is sheer speculation. If that was the question being asked, that's about all I have to say.
There's a page where he is comparing reformist and revolutionary events in the history of these systems. I can't now find the page immediately. And those revolutionary episodes that he speaks about, only one involved violence, namely Hungary in 1956. So he is, whether he advocated it or not, and I don't think that he did, the actual transition from state socialism has been basically nonviolent, and I don't think particularly revolutionary is the right way to describe it. But you also mentioned you think of this book as positivist, and that surprises me because it's a highly theoretical study, and I would say that the criticism that Sanjay and I are making is that he's not, in lots of respects, being empirical enough. That is just too much neglect of empirical difference and an empirical possibility growing out of those differences. It's an extremely abstract. I mean, I think within the field of economics, maybe Sanjay can say this doesn't seem like a particularly positivistic work. Right? I mean, he uses, of course, some quantitative information, but he explains everything also qualitatively. And non-economists can read him very well, which cannot be said about every economist today. This is a question of you as an economist. And it doesn't have to be Kornai anymore. I mean, we can get off him. Here's the question. What do you think from market socialist practices, and including a worker self-management practice in Yugoslavia, do you think would be adoptable for a future project? In other words, let's even broaden the thing. State socialism too. Let's have state socialism, market socialism, and self-managing systems. What of their experiences, devices, techniques, do you think are still potentially alive today? And on the other hand, the obverse of this would be what of Kornai's concept would be usable for a future socialist or radical or reformist project?
Right.
It's a very difficult question, but it has a lot of parts, so you can pick whichever part.
Yes. So thank you, Andrew. I think it is a challenging, extremely challenging question, but it's very important. I started off by saying that we ought to be subjecting our utopias to scrutiny from a realist point of view. And that is, I think, the offering which Kornai makes to us. And whatever Kornai's limitations, whatever his partiality, which I think has been well plumbed by both of us and by others in this discussion, what Kornai does do is to offer us a rather clear-eyed view of some of the limitations of existing socialism. There might be distortions in that in respect of particular cases, but nevertheless, he has picked out some of the real difficulties which that system did encounter. He may have exaggerated them, but there was an element of reality to those difficulties, which he brings to the fore, right? And I think that that is tremendously important as a conceptual resource in order to try to more properly scrutinize the different options that are presented to us. So, for example, let's take state-owned enterprises, which you just mentioned, right? Suppose that somebody says it's a very good idea to nationalize X, Y, or Z in order to have a particular good or service be produced more efficiently and distributed more equitably. Well, I would say in respect of that, indeed, there are arguments for doing so. There may well be arguments for doing so, which of course may depend on the particular good or service in question. Those arguments might apply more forcefully to some particular sectors or industries than to others. But we ought also to adopt a realist perspective insofar as we should look at the actual experience with management of state-owned enterprises around the world. And the point of looking at that experience is not to come to the conclusion, the dichotomous conclusion, either that state-owned enterprises work perfectly well or that they are everywhere complete failures, but rather to learn about how it is that we might organize them and how it is that we might manage or govern them so that they are less subject to some of the difficulties that they may be. So, for example, as you know, with respect to state-owned enterprises, there's been a very long discussion about what are the realistic mechanisms of disciplining and accountability that could exist for them, right? The soft budget constraint, excuse me, is a problem on one side. But on the other side, there's been the idea that there might be administrative mechanisms of various sorts, third-party scrutiny to ensure accountability of their various functions, performance contracts, for example, which the state-owned enterprises undertake vis-a-vis the government, and other mechanisms to try to reduce the so-called principal agent problem, if you want to use that language, which exists. And I think that once we get into that intermediate territory of talking about what are the different mechanisms which can be employed to allow state-owned enterprises to work better rather than worse, to ensure that they have a better return on capital, for example, and don't squander the social resources, or to ensure that they don't just become sites of plum employment, but they also take very seriously their service function vis-a-vis the society at large, to ensure that they maintain certain technical efficiencies and cost disciplines, and so on and so forth. Then I think we're having a much richer discussion. And it's a discussion which is also pragmatic. It's getting into the weeds, so to speak, the details of how it is that one makes something do well. And when one starts to have this discussion, then the dividing line between the capitalist and the socialist economies, not as idealized entities, but as real entities, starts to break down. Because we see that, as Schumpeter saw, and as Raymond Aron saw, and as various other convergence theorists, so to speak, of the mid-20th century saw, Galbraith saw, the giant private enterprise, such as General Motors, and the giant state-owned enterprise, such as, I don't know, Électricité de France, they actually have a lot of commonalities. And some of the same kinds of problems arise with respect to managing both. So I think then can have a more thoughtful discussion about how to use those instruments, use those mechanisms in order to get what we want, which is to say efficiency and equity and social objectives of various kinds being served. And I would say the same thing with respect to market socialism based on enterprises which are not easy to define either as purely private or as state-owned, but which are worker-owned and managed or other such. We can and should ask the question, when does an ecology, when does an industry which consists of this kind of enterprises succeed? Or when is it possible for it to exist? What kind of supports are necessary for it? For example, we know there's a large literature on worker-owned and managed firms and the difficulties they have in getting finance, major constraint for them. For which reason, it's essential that there be a supportive finance function in the form of cooperative banks or indeed state-owned banks or others that are providing finance for those enterprises. and which of course subject them to suitable disciplines. How would that work? How does that work in practice? The Mondragon system in France, for example, of worker-owned enterprises has its own cooperative banking system to support those enterprises. So these are the kinds of, I think, more detailed questions we get into. And if you want to call those positivist, you can. I don't know what that achieves besides, leading us in the direction of theory unanchored from reality. Because in the end, these are the questions that one has to answer if one is concerned about building a social science and a political program that's responsive to the need of human beings for their lives to go well, returning to Amartya Sen.
If I could say something on the same line, John Roemer, The Future of Socialism, we read it in another class a couple of years ago, and I seem to remember that he actually suggests that any contemporary socialist project should take the soft budgetary constraint seriously as a problem. I don't remember what his examples were, but let me give you an example, which would be, I think, familiar to all of us because we're all in that situation collectively right now, namely healthcare. I mean, one solution, and it is right on the table in the United States, even Bernie Sanders is now out of the campaign, but his ideas obviously have affected the Democratic Party, is a single payer healthcare, state managed, controlled, ultimately owned system. And it seems to me, first of all, comparativist, as Sanjay says, we should be comparativists. There are such systems around the world, and we should actually look at how they work and what their issues are. Secondly, we're also theorists. And if we apply Kornai's theory, what would be the expectation theoretically from such a system, leaving aside the empirical cases of Canada, United Kingdom, they're all different in this respect. The theoretical expectation would be one word: shortage. I don't know how you feel about that, Sanjay, but theoretically speaking, if from, let us say, ordinary taxes, you finance a healthcare system, and that healthcare system then becomes free for the consumers, namely the people who have problems, who experience sickness or whatever. The demand will grow, and Kornai says this in lots of places in other contexts. The demand will become, he says, infinite sometimes, but uncontrollable. The demand would be uncontrollable for those. And no country, certainly not, no system of taxes can support uncontrollable expansion of demand. So taking Kornai's concept seriously, and I have for a long time worked with them in different contexts, I would say that such a system would be important because it would solve things that the current private system cannot solve, but it should be also protected from the worst possible outcomes. And I would say that can only work if you add competition to the system. So I'm surprised that that at least some of the advocates, Bernie Sanders for one, think that private insurance should be abolished if you establish a state-controlled and state-organized, coordinated system. By the way, empirically speaking, that's not the case in Germany, not the case in Switzerland, not the case in France, and not the case probably in Italy, although I should check. Certainly most such systems, the United Kingdom is pretty exceptional, have competition for the state sector in the world of medical services and outputs. And I think that certainly with respect to overcoming shortage phenomena, overcoming lack of innovation, overcoming spending more on bureaucracy than on the actual services, which is probably a problem in a purely state-owned system, spending more on bureaucracy than on the services. These problems could be mitigated. So if we follow Kornai and try to imagine a healthcare system we might wish to figure out how to not create a shortage system in the place of what we currently have, which has a lot of shortages for the poor, but it is not a shortage system in general. So, for example, that to me is an example of how concepts of Kornai and at the same time comparative experience can help us. And the same goes for workers' self-management. The same goes for a state-owned sector of industrial production. It would go, there's a lot to learn from in almost all these domains. And Kornai's concepts, I think, will help us learn in such instances. By the way, the outcome in the United States certainly will be a mixed system of some kind at best. And I think that would mean that the US would rejoin most of the world. And I'm not even sure if the UK at this point does not have elements of mixed system. So I think the idea of a purely state-owned system of healthcare, state-controlled system of healthcare, is probably the exception rather than the rule. Certainly Canada has also the possibility of private supplements for its national healthcare system. So that would be one example of how we could make concepts coming from this particular author useful. You don't have to agree. János, you are next.
Back to the political economy and the comparison between socialism and capitalism. I think, Sanjay, you mentioned a key word, which I'm very sensitive and focused on in terms of political economy, is the concept of rents. And I think it's important because it explains, that term explains why both systems that we call, again, quote unquote capitalist and quote unquote socialist fail. And I think that's what I would think, even though Kornai was close to describing the insidious and the unproductive consequences of rent seeking in the socialist economy, and he found that he found the solution there. That's the reason why the socialist system fails. It doesn't fail because it has welfare tendencies. It doesn't have because it has egalitarian tendencies. It doesn't fail because it has a central management element, which, as we see today, they're necessary. The difference is that, again, the so-called capitalist system also fails in that sense, because if you see why inequality happens in the so-called capitalist system, okay, it's because, again, of rampant rent seeking, and the fact that he failed to pinpoint that rent-seeking element is the reason for failure of or as a substantive criticism of the Western so-called capitalist system. I think it's palpable and should be noted. Now, my question comes to this point. I believe that the terms socialism and capitalism are misleading. And the reason I'm saying that is because if you really take a textbook definition of what capitalism is, that's not what's practiced in the West. So why do we assign such a virtuous name, and again, from a capitalist perspective, to a system that doesn't work as capitalism? There is no fair competition. There is no price discovery. All these elements of a capitalist system are not practiced in the so-called quote-unquote capitalist system. So my conjecture is that the systems, both what we used to call socialism and what we used to call capitalist, are both rentalist system. Rents are the real arbiters of how wealth is going to be distributed and apportioned in both systems. And then what makes them differ is how they're going to manage these misallocations. And in that sense, the Western called quote-unquote capitalism is more successful because it's less rigid in how it's managing these crisis is a pandemic crisis or an inequality crisis or a market failure. And I think that's the distinguishing factor.
Yes, got it. Yeah, look, I think there's a lot of truth to that. I think that's a very interesting point. And rents are experienced in different forms in different kinds of economic system, but they can be captured and retained over long periods of time, right? Whether it's by nomenclatura or whether it's by bankers or whatever. So there could be a whole comparative economic analysis of rents, how they arise, how they are managed, which is what you are suggesting. I think that's quite interesting. I think you're right, perhaps, about the flexibility, although, of course, one should not underestimate the ability of plutocrats to retain their rents through measures which subordinate the political system, which is exactly, I think, what a huge part of the discussion post-2008 is about, the capture of the political system by those elites and how they are reshaping it so as to ensure the long-term sustainability of their wealth, sustenance of their wealth, which, of course, Jeffrey Winter, the sociologist, has argued is the essence of oligarchy, and by which standard he views the United States as an oligarchy, because he thinks that public policies are increasingly made in the United States with this aim, right? Now, of course, wealth and rents are not the same thing, but wealth often arises from rents, supernormal returns, which would otherwise be bid away if there were not special privileges or competition, right? And that's one reason that in the US tradition, especially of progressivism, there's an enormous emphasis on antitrust policy, or what's called competition policy elsewhere. And this is, I think, idealized by many people as being a sufficient solution to the ills of capitalism, which I think it also may not be. So I think we have to recognize that imposing capitalism on the capitalists, so to speak, through competition policy has its role to play, but that may not be sufficient to bring about a capitalism that doesn't possess various ills, right? And Amartya Sen pointed this out to Robert Nozick, that you could have a catastrophe such as a famine that was completely compatible with all of the idealized conditions of general equilibrium theory, right? Including non-existence of rents, firms that earn zero profits, but still, because the initial endowments and particular prices that emerge, it might be that there's starvation. And there's nothing in general equilibrium theory that can prevent that from happening. And Sen said, ironically, or wryly, this would be a case of market success, quote unquote, because it would be compatible with the theory, but it would be, of course, a disaster. And this caused Nozick to partially revise his view and say that he would make an exception for his property rights, otherwise completely absolutist property rights protection framework, for what he called catastrophic moral horrors, recognizing that that could happen even in a rent-free capitalism, right? So we have to probably have additional layers as well. Let me mention, and this will amuse you, Andrew, that when Nancy Fraser spoke on her ideas about socialism in Frankfurt, I happened to hear her in Frankfurt speak about this. I asked her a question about the economic realism of her proposal, and she didn't have much of an answer. But one of the examples that I gave to her was the following. I said, look, there's a problem which besets firms everywhere and besets political systems everywhere, whether it's under so-called socialism or under capitalism. And it's this, and it's actually purely arithmetical. A firm can, in a unit of time, have negative profits, zero profits, or positive profits. These are the three possibilities. And if it has negative profits, it can be allowed to go out of business, or it can be bailed out, right? And whether or not to do so is a political problem. If it has zero profits, then there's no immediate exigency to address the political problem, perhaps, but that's an idealized case, which, although prominent in economic theory, is basically a knife edge. And on the other side, you have the case of positive profits, but that too generates a political problem, which is, how do you distribute that surplus, right? And whether it's capitalism, whether it's socialism, there's a question to resolve there. So the problem of economic organization, and in particular the disposition of surplus, is a reason that economic questions are always political, wherever they are. And socialist systems need to have a way of addressing this question, which also recognizes the need to organize the production of those surpluses on an ongoing basis and not simply their distribution. I'm not sure she'd thought that problem through, but anyway, I just thought I'd relate that. If I could very briefly say something about your points on medicine and the likelihood of shortages. I think that's a really interesting case, in part because of the ways in which medicine is different from other kinds of goods production in capitalism, or could be potentially. And one of the reasons is that there are spillovers, positive externalities that are involved. And we're seeing this right now in the current infection. And with infections generally, if people are not covered, if they don't have adequate health care, then they're more likely to be infectious. And so it's in the interests of other people that they should be covered. And that's one of the reasons that the argument for shortage resulting from a greater public hand in relation to the healthcare system may be mistaken, because that public hand, by ensuring that people are covered, may also help to produce. It doesn't just distribute, but it produces healthcare for all because of the externalities that are involved. But I quite agree with you that it's a good example of the way in which we cannot reduce the consideration to one of the state versus the private sector. There are many, many different kinds of intermediaries involved in different systems. As you say, Germany also has a private layer to the health insurance system, for example. Almost every European country, indeed the United States also, have many actors who are, at least in principle, not for profit. Hospitals with a religious foundation, for example, which play a huge role in the production of healthcare. And that's because the motivational framework that underpins the provision of medicine is not simply the garnering of profit, even in advanced capitalist economies. Of course, there are elements of profit making, but they're not only that, not purely that. And we have to recognize and understand what that range of human motivations is or could be if we're going to really think in a pragmatic way about healthcare or anything else.
Yeah, I apologize because I reduced the issue to a dichotomous structure, and of course there are three, because private can be profit-making and can be non-profit. And most European countries, the private part of it is non-profit. The German Krankenkasse are not profit-making private firms. But I think the first part of your remark indicates that there is a very strong reason for a universal system and for creating a system that is universal. So, for example, the way I would do it is that a citizen has a right to join a private Krankenkasse, a private entity that insures. But if you don't join one, you're automatically enrolled in the public one. In other words, you don't want people who are, in the case of a plague like this, who are uninsured and therefore are not going to get health care. So you can produce a universal system, which is a mixed system. I shouldn't go on this because it's a specialized topic, and perhaps it's not the most important one, except for us right now. It is sort of salient. Anybody else has any issue?
I was wondering if he's had any opinions or analysis of the rise of the Fidesz and then in Hungary, and of course, if he considers it as anti-democratic, does he in any way connected to the privatization policies or the way that capitalism has worked out in Hungary since the transformation? If it's not, if it's related, I don't know. I was just wondering about this.
Well, I'm very interested in this topic, obviously, and I think that there is a problem with Kornai on this particular score. Now, he himself has called the system that Fidesz instituted since 2010 an autocracy. As I said, that goes too far for me, because Hungary has elections. For example, the Budapest elections were won by the opposition, and in many other provincial cities too. And in spite of everything, there is a public sphere in which people can participate. Right now, there's an emergency because of COVID. And so for a moment, I think it's a kind of emergency regime, a kind of dictatorship. But that I don't think is going to survive. So I don't agree with him on this. But I think much more important is the fact whether the model of economic transition that he and many others introduced contributed to the outcome. I mean, after all, the consequences of a fairly rapid transition to a capitalist economy had some relationship to what has occurred subsequently. For example, the very large level of unemployment which occurred, the deindustrialization of whole sectors of the country. That would be, I think, worthwhile to compare with China, where the continuation of the state-controlled sector has avoided that type of outcome. And then inequality, which is not avoided in China either, but is nevertheless a very serious problem in Hungary. So whether these side effects of the transition to capitalism had something to do with the authoritarian turn, I think would be an interesting question to ask Kornai. He has not faced this in any way, so he does not discuss the transition and its nature and the outcome. But I think it would be a worthwhile topic because, I mean, after all, it's not just Hungary, it is also Poland, even more importantly, Russia and some of the ex-Soviet republics. So authoritarian outcomes are part of the picture of the new East Central Europe and even further to the east, West Asia. So I think in this sense, there's a responsibility. Now, I'm not so sure that anybody today would have the answer, but at least it'd be worthwhile to discuss the relationship of rapid decollectivization of agriculture in economies where the collectives were relatively well functioning. That's true for Hungary, for example. Yugoslavia too. I think that would be an important issue. And deindustrialization, overly radical opening to competition abroad. In other words, the introduction of well, it's been called, the economics profession calls it hyperglobalization, the turn to a hyperglobalized form of capitalism. All these have to have some kind of relationship to the outcome. I don't think Kornai has faced it in any way.
Yes, I wanted to bring the issue of success, because it seems to me that we have kind of a one-sided type of success. And I wanted actually to counter to Kornai that actually the socialist systems, and okay, maybe I'm mainly referring to the Soviet Union per se, but I think there was a unified success in the Eastern Bloc in terms of science and even technology, I should say, and military capability, which I think it's their cornerstone. I mean, the military is the driver of technology. We see today in the US, there is this military complex that drives the technological one. So the East, I think, had surpassed the West, at least during the times of the Cold War. So the issue of who one was more successful than the other, that's actually when I raise a little bit of a debate, and I think it depends on which aspect of the economy you are focusing on. What's your comment on that? Like what I'm trying to say is that in the frontier economic achievement, I think the socialist system was more successful than the Western one. And if I may throw like a little joke, I think the 1980s boycott eagerness to boycott the Moscow Olympics by the US was that they were afraid to be dwarfed. Not dwarfed, I mean, not that much, but they would be eclipsed in athletic achievement by the Soviets, I think.
Well, we'll let Sanjay answer this, and that should be the end. But let me add my 2 cents in, or rather just translate something that János said. Was this system, this experience discussed by Kornai, relatively successful? And does it make sense to treat it as nothing but a failure?
Right.
Perhaps
that's my point.
Question. So we will let you finish up, Sanjay.
Well, I'm sure I should not have the last word on that, but I think it's a great question, and we pointed to some aspects of it implicitly, I think, during our discussion. There are questions of what are the social outcomes which are generated by different systems, right? And from that standpoint, it's quite clear that capitalism, in some of its variants at least, US capitalism, for example, may be enormously productive of wealth, but not very good at eliminating poverty, maybe terribly bad at doing so, even as compared with existing socialist systems that were much inferior in terms of production of wealth for in particular for consumers, consumer opportunities of various kinds. So that's one aspect of the response, surely, that has to enter what kinds of social outcomes we consider to be pertinent to determining whether or not there's success. But another aspect has to do with directed goals of various kinds. And I think that the Eastern Bloc was incredibly successful. Former Soviet Union in particular was incredibly successful when it put its mind to specific technological goals. And of course, some of these were easier for that system to achieve than others, but its excellence in the production of military equipment, for instance, not in every area, but in many areas, was remarkable and still allows Russia to this day to be a major arms exporter as a result of that legacy, for instance. And also in other areas, you mentioned athletics. Of course, it could be an unprincipled approach to athletic success, which is involved, but nevertheless, clear-cut success when you make it a matter of national prestige to do that. So I think that you're quite right to raise that issue. Andrew, if I could refer briefly to something you said. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah, of course.
Yes, just very briefly, I would like to just echo what you've said and suggest that we may think of Kornai perhaps as having had having made an effort to present an empirical portrait of the socialist system, but ultimately having presented only a highly stylized portrait of that system. In fact, so stylized that you have raised the question as to whether it was in fact able to capture central facts about that system, which are revealed by the variations within it. For instance, between the former Yugoslavia and former Soviet Union. Very stark differences which were not perhaps properly apprehended. But with respect to the capitalist system, it seems that he made very little effort at all, that he took a stylized portrait and he embraced it. And I think that this is really at the heart of the problem. One shouldn't be, I think, partially empirical, but one should be comprehensively empirical.
If I can ask you a small thing, in line with János's question before, Kornai, in one place in this text, which is so enormous that he discusses everything in a way, mentions the distinction between extensive and intensive.
Right, I saw that, yes.
And that distinction, which is developed by others, not by him first, but he adopts it. Is that perhaps a clue to what the Soviet system can be successful at, Soviet type system, and what it cannot be? The extensive, for those who don't know this terminology, the extensive form of development is when development depends on bringing in new factors, so more of the same factors into production. So using more labor, using more land, using more raw materials. It's adding more factors of production. Whereas intensive is making the factors of production more productive. The intensive development is based on productivity. the extensive development is based on adding more resources. And of course, Soviet Union had enormous amount of resources in a certain phase. The military might speak against this because the military, it was able to maintain on a very high level, even in the late period when everything else was more or less in shambles. But perhaps Castoriadis's book on this subject is right, that for the military, no resource was considered to be too expensive. In other words, for the military remained in a kind of extensive bubble within an economy that needed intensive development. Do you think this theory can help in explaining how such a thing could be so successful? For example, in the Second World War, which is an enormous success. Obviously, I owe my life to their success as far as that goes. Or, but whether in another phase, it is only some sectors where success can be guaranteed. If you concentrate on putting so much resource into sports, you can do well. But that is not an efficient use of using the human resources. And certainly where efficiency is called for, this system did not really succeed. I don't agree, by the way, that on the level of technological development, it competes with the West. It does not. It's only military technology. There's no other area of technological development, I think, important enough where they were really competitive. Indeed, they have to basically adopt Western technologies in almost every area. That goes for the most modern technology of all, obviously, namely communication technology. So do you make anything of this extensive, intensive distinction, Sanjay?
So Andrew, thanks very much. I saw that he had made that distinction, and interestingly, he connected it to environmental damage, that he viewed the socialist system as being hugely damaging in agriculture and other areas for that reason. You know, the Aral Sea Disaster was one example of that, of course. So that was very interesting, because I don't know that he talked much about environment elsewhere.
Because it means that, you know, the land, the air are not costs. You pay no attention to it. You bring in just as much as you need for the particular purpose. And he has some tables where he illustrates the differences between the capitalist countries and the state socialist ones on a level of environmental issues. And the result is a disaster. As we all knew, at least Ihor, your parents must have known, because you're too young. But those of us, you know, who visited both East and West Germany know how much worse the air and how much worse the water were in the eastern part. And in spite of the fact that West Germany is much more industrialized than East Germany. So this aspect, I think, is pretty significant. We think capitalism is horrible for the environment, which is true, but state socialism was even worse.
Absolutely, and not much appreciated. But I think you're quite right. We're probably out of time, I realize, but let me just say that indeed, this is a hugely important question. The sheer wastage of savings in the former socialist systems was very considerable because of the low rates of return on capital, which is another way to look at it. That's the extensive versus intensive margin. And we can see this also in the way that that system succeeded in certain technological aims, but failed in others. For example, it was good at sending rockets to outer space, but it was very bad at miniaturization of electronics. And I think that that reflected, in part, exactly this distinction. So, you know, a more decentralized system which creates disciplines of various kinds, which allocates capital flexibly and so forth, is one of the advantages of capitalism, but it could also be one of the advantages of a modern market socialism.
Okay, thank you very much. This was great, and we really are appreciative that you took the time out and that you helped us think through some of these issues. So thanks a lot.
Thank you.
All the best to everybody.
Great fun. Thank you. Very much enjoyed it.